England should not exist. In the year 937, one king, Athelstan, faced an army larger than anything Britain had ever seen. Vikings from Dublin, the King of Scotland. Three nations united for one purpose: to erase England from history. By nightfall, tens of thousands were dead, and England was born. This is not a story about victory, because victory implies something already existed, something solid enough to be defended. In 937, England was neither solid nor guaranteed nor ancient. It was an idea, a dangerous one, an idea that said this fractured island, long ruled by rival kings, foreign raiders, and shifting borders, could be something more than contested ground. England in that moment was not a nation. It was a claim, and claims invite challenge. Athelstan understood this. He did not rule an inherited country. He ruled a construction still drying, its foundations untested, its walls not yet trusted by those who lived behind them. For generations, power in Britain had been temporary. Kings rose, kings fell. Borders moved with every army. No ruler before had dared to say, "This is final." But Athelstan did. And the moment he did, the island began to move against him. Because England's neighbors did not see a kingdom. They saw a threat, a single ruler claiming authority over lands that had always been disputed, a king declaring unity where division had been tradition. If that claim succeeded, the balance of power across Britain would collapse. So in 937, the response was absolute. Not negotiation, not pressure, not tribute, erasure. An army unlike anything Britain had seen before began to converge from every direction. From the west came Viking forces hardened by exile and plunder. From the north marched the King of Scotland himself, not sending men, but coming in person. This was not a raid. It was not a test. It was a verdict. And at the center of it stood one man and a single line of shields. That is why this is not a story about conquest. Because if Athelstan fell at Brunanburh, England would not be conquered. Conquest assumes survival. Conquest leaves something behind. England would leave nothing. No crown to inherit, no capital to occupy, no kingdom to rule. The idea itself would die on that field. The island would return to what it had always been, a place where unity failed and power never lasted. That is the question Brunanburh asks. Not who won, but whether England was allowed to exist at all. Because on that day, the shield wall did not just protect soldiers, it protected an idea still fragile enough to be destroyed in a single afternoon. A line that could break, a king who could fall, a country that could disappear without leaving a trace. And that is why Brunanburh matters. Not because of glory, not because of banners or speeches, but because for the first time in history, England stood on the edge of non-existence and did not step back. For centuries, Britain was not a country. It was a battlefield pretending to be an island. Every shoreline carried the memory of fire. Every road remembered marching feet. Every border existed only until the next army crossed it. Anglo-Saxon kingdoms rose with confidence and fell just as quickly. Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria. Names that meant power for a generation and irrelevance the next. From the sea came the Vikings, not as conquerors at first, but as a warning. They burned coastlines, then returned to claim the cities that survived the flames. York, Dublin. Trade hubs turned into war hubs. To the north, Scotland pressed southward, testing how far the frontier could be pushed before resistance solidified. To the west, the Britons clung to older lands, older languages, older grudges. Britain was crowded with rulers, but it was empty of authority. Power existed everywhere, and nowhere lasted long enough to matter. No king could say with certainty that his rule would survive his lifetime. No crown could guarantee succession without bloodshed following close behind. And beneath every conflict lay the same unanswered question, a question no one dared to settle. Who rules all the English? Not one kingdom, not one city, not one generation, but all of them. And what happens when someone finally claims that title? Because in Britain, titles were not neutral. They were provocations. Athelstan did not inherit a nation. He inherited fragments, lands recently conquered, rulers recently subdued, alliances held together by convenience, not loyalty. What Athelstan did next was not traditional kingship. It was construction. He assembled England piece by piece, sometimes with armies, sometimes with treaties, sometimes with marriages that bought silence where swords would have bought resentment. Each decision was calculated, not for glory, not for expansion, but for permanence. By the early 930s, Athelstan ruled more territory than any English king before him, from the southern coast to the old Viking strongholds of the north. On maps, England finally began to look whole, but maps lie. Because unity on parchment does not mean unity in reality. Athelstan's authority was wide, but it was thin. Every region he ruled contained men who remembered ruling themselves. Every neighboring power watched closely, waiting. And then Athelstan made the most dangerous move of his reign. He declared that this arrangement was not temporary. He stopped speaking like a war leader and started speaking like a founder. By calling himself King of the English, Athelstan crossed an invisible line. He was no longer claiming victory. He was claiming legitimacy, not dominance for a moment, but ownership of the future. That single title forced every ruler around him into a choice they could not avoid. Accept England as a permanent power, or destroy it before it hardened. Because if Athelstan was allowed to succeed, then the age of shifting borders was ending, and with it, the freedom of his rivals to raid, reclaim, and renegotiate. England would stop being negotiable. To the kings of Scotland, that was unacceptable. To the Viking rulers of the Irish Sea, that was a threat to survival. To the Britons of the West, it was the final confirmation that their world was closing in. So the response was inevitable. Not debate, not compromise, but coalition. Because no single enemy could break England alone. But together, they might still tear it apart before it finished becoming real. Athelstan had gambled everything on one idea, that England once declared could survive being challenged. The next chapter of this story would decide whether that belief was vision or fatal arrogance. This is the moment where history tightens, because what happened next was not reaction, it was preparation. The response to England's existence was swift, not chaotic, not emotional, but calculated. From the Irish Sea came Olaf Guthfrithson, not a raider, not a prince chasing fame, but the leader of a Norse Gaelic war machine forged in exile, survival, and plunder. His men were not farmers with spears. They were professionals, descended from those who had lost kingdoms before and learned how to take new ones. They had crossed seas, burned cities, and rebuilt power from nothing. England to Olaf was not sacred. It was unfinished. From the north marched Constantine II, a king who had ruled Scotland for more than 40 years, long enough to see rivals rise and vanish. He did not come as a subordinate. He came as an equal, and he had no intention of bowing to a Saxon ruler who had declared permanence where none had ever been allowed. To Constantine, England was not a neighbor. It was a ceiling, and ceilings are meant to be broken before they lower. With them came the Britons of Strathclyde, not newcomers, not opportunists, but old enemies of Wessex, older than England itself. They remembered a Briton before Saxon crowns, before Viking sails, before this new name, England, threatened to erase what remained of their world. These forces did not meet by accident. This was not coincidence. It was coordination. Messages crossed seas. Envoys crossed borders. Old grudges were set aside for a single calculation. 3 powers, 3 histories, 3 reasons to fear the same outcome. A united England. And so they aligned not because they trusted each other, but because they understood the moment. If England survived now, it would not be stoppable later. The coalition did not march south to negotiate. There were no demands, no ultimatums. They came to annihilate. Because this war was not about land, it was about existence. If Athelstan lost at Brunanburh, there would be no replacement king, no council to crown another, no dynasty waiting in reserve. England was too new for that, too fragile. If Athelstan fell, the idea died with him. There would be no successor state, no England to rebuild, only territories to be divided by those strong enough to take them. This was a war where defeat meant erasure, and both sides understood it. That knowledge shaped everything. The coalition did not plan supply lines for retreat. They did not position forces for withdrawal. They marched with the understanding that this would end one way. Either England survived the day, or it vanished from history. Athelstan knew this too, which is why his army did not prepare for maneuver. There would be no clever escape, no tactical withdrawal, only a line that held or broke. This is what makes Brunanburh different from so many medieval battles. Most wars allowed recovery. This one did not. There would be no second attempt, no rematch. The coalition had gathered every force willing to risk everything. If they failed, they would never unite again. The cost would be too high, the dead too many, the lesson too clear. That is why neither side planned to retreat, because retreat assumed a future. And for one of them, there would be none. As the armies moved toward each other, they carried more than weapons. They carried certainty that by nightfall, one political reality would cease to exist. Either England would finally become real, or it would be erased before it finished forming. And somewhere ahead, on a field whose name history would argue over for centuries, that decision was waiting. This is where strategy ends, and consequence begins. Because Brunanburh was not chosen for glory, it was chosen for finality. No one knows exactly where the field lay. Historians still argue over hills, rivers, and names, but everyone agrees on one thing. It was open ground. No walls, no forest to disappear into, no fortifications to fall back on, no escape. That was the point. This was not a battlefield designed to be clever. It was designed to be honest. Whatever happened here would be decided face to face. Athelstan understood that, so he did not spread his army wide. He did not attempt flanking maneuvers. He did not gamble on speed or surprise. He did something far more dangerous. He formed a single line, shield locked to shield. Men pressed so close that retreat was physically impossible. This was not elegance, it was commitment. Athelstan knew something his enemies did not want to accept. This battle would not be won by brilliance. There would be no decisive charge, no dramatic breakthrough. Victory would belong to the side that could remain standing longer than the other could remain alive. Endurance, not courage, would decide England's fate. Every man in that line understood what it meant. Behind them, there was nothing. Ahead of them, everything was coming. The battle began at dawn, not with a roar, not with a charge, but with silence. Two armies moving forward slowly, deliberately, until shields struck shields. The sound was not heroic. It was impact, wood splintering, metal screaming, breath leaving lungs in short, panicked bursts. There was no space to run. Men fought where they stood because there was nowhere else to go. Hour after hour, the lines pushed and recoiled. Not meters, not steps, inches. Progress was measured in bodies. Arms grew heavy beneath shields held too long in the wrong position. Sweat burned eyes. Breath shortened. Men fought until their arms failed. Then they fought with knives. Blades finding gaps in armor, finding ribs, finding throats. When weapons broke or vanished, they fought with fists, grabbing, dragging, forcing opponents down into the press where weight alone could kill. This was not a moment. It was a process. A slow, grinding destruction that consumed everything fed into it. The sun climbed, and still the line did not break. By midday, the field was unrecognizable. The ground was no longer earth. It was something else entirely. Packed, churned, and covered with what remained of men. Movement became difficult, then dangerous, then impossible. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle would later try to describe it, not with metaphor, not with praise, but with numbers. Never yet in this island was there a greater slaughter of people. This was not poetry, it was inventory, a record of absence. Sons who did not return, lords who did not answer. Names that ended on that field without ceremony or memory. And still, the fighting continued, because neither side could afford to stop. To stop was to break, and to break was to cease to exist. As the afternoon wore on, exhaustion began to decide what weapons could not. Armor that once protected now trapped heat. Horses, bred for speed, not endurance, collapsed. Men stumbled not from wounds, but from depletion. This was the hour that broke armies, not with fear, but with fatigue. And through it all, Athelstan's line remained. Not advancing, not retreating, simply refusing to disappear. By the time the sun began to fall, the battle had consumed everything it could take. What remained on the field would decide the future of an island, because by nightfall, one political reality would still be standing, and the other would never recover. This is where battles end, not with a charge, not with a shout, but with exhaustion. By midday, the field was no longer a place of movement. It was a place of accumulation. Bodies covered the ground, not in piles, but layered, pressed into the earth by hours of wait and struggle. Men stepped where they could and fell where they could not. Two sons of the Scottish king lay among the dead, not fallen in retreat, not surrounded in flight, but where the line had held until holding became impossible. Constantine II survived the day, but survival came at a price older than kingship itself. His line did not. For a ruler who had governed for more than 4 decades, this was not just a defeat, it was an ending. Nearby, Viking nobles fell where they stood. Men who had crossed seas, survived exile, and rebuilt power from nothing, stopped here. Some fought until their strength gave out, others until space disappeared, all of them until the day consumed them. Olaf Guthfrithson escaped the field, but escape is not victory. Behind him, his army collapsed, not in panic, but in pieces. Groups cut off, lines broken, momentum gone. The coalition had reached its limit, and still, through hours of pressure, through losses that would have broken lesser forces, Athelstan's shield wall did not move, not forward, not back. It simply endured. This was not stubbornness, it was calculation. Athelstan had understood from the beginning that this battle would be decided not by courage, but by depletion, by whose men collapsed first, by whose line lost coherence. And when that moment came, It came quietly. No trumpet sounded, no signal was given. One side simply could not continue. Endurance that day decided everything. When the fighting ended, there was no celebration, no raised swords, no chants, only silence. The kind that follows when sound itself has been exhausted. The first to return were the birds. They circled low, uncertain at first, then settled. After them came the wolves, drawn by instinct older than nations. The dead were left where they fell, not out of disrespect, but because there were too many to bury. Too many lives ended to be honored individually. Brunanburh did not end war. It did something far more significant. It ended the question. No coalition would ever again unite to destroy England, not because the enemies were gone, but because the cost had been revealed. The price of erasing England was now written plainly across a field, in blood, in silence, in absence. Kings would still fight, borders would still shift, but never again would three powers risk everything on the assumption that England could be undone in a single day. That belief died at Brunanburh. What remained afterward was not triumph, it was reality. England had been tested at the moment of its creation and had not collapsed. No monument marked the field, no capital fell, no empire rose overnight, but the future moved, quietly, irreversibly. Because after Brunanburh, England was no longer a fragile idea. It was a fact, paid for in lives, secured by endurance, and remembered not for how it began, but for what it refused to become undone. History usually remembers victories. Brunanburh remembers consequences. Because what followed this battle was not triumph, it was silence. Athelstan would die only 2 years later. No empire followed him, no dynasty expanded outward, no new wars were launched in his name. There was no coronation scene, no parade, no monument raised where men had fallen. If Brunanburh were judged by spectacle, it would seem almost forgettable. But history does not move by spectacle alone. It moves by decisions that cannot be undone. From that day forward, England was no longer a proposal, no longer an experiment in unity, no longer a temporary arrangement held together by force. It was a fact. Before Brunanburh, England existed only as long as no one challenged it. After Brunanburh, it existed because it had survived being challenged. That distinction mattered more than crowns, charters, or treaties. Every king who ruled England after 937 did so without needing to prove that England itself should exist. That argument had already been settled, not in council chambers, but on a field soaked in blood. Every border drawn afterward, every negotiation with Scotland, every treaty with Viking successors, rested on the same foundation. Not law, not tradition, but endurance. Brunanburh did not give England peace. It gave England permanence. And permanence changes everything. It means enemies must adapt. It means rivals must negotiate. It means that conquest becomes more costly than coexistence. That is why no coalition ever again formed with the sole purpose of erasing England. Not because hatred disappeared, but because the price had been made clear. The battlefield had answered the question that diplomacy never could. England could bleed and still remain. Brunanburh is not remembered because it was glorious. There are no heroes carved into stone, no epic poems celebrating triumph. It is remembered because it was final. Here, a nation was not imagined. It was not debated. It was not declared. It was survived. England was born not from ink, not from crowns, but from bones.